religious texts, and the text is in inverted commas because that's a question.
Not all religions focus on text.
That's not the reason. But often these days, particularly in critical studies which this is following, people use text to mean basically everything. Buildings, the material world, anything if you like can be read, and therefore you can treat it in some ways as a text, something that you ought to look at and understand. And we'll start off by giving people called the masters of suspicion. Just before we get to them, a little long quote here, which I'll let you read. I don't think it needs much explanation. Basically, you know, we live in sort of certain places, and the habits, the culture, the society around us, we just think that's the way things are. We don't stop and think about it and actually think, well, other places do things differently, or other times have also, of course, done things differently. But I said to some degree it is quite a sort of a modern way of looking at the world. In the past, there seems to be less, if you like, reflexivity around this and awareness that the world could be different. I said it's partly sort of related to a number of people who have sort of questioned this. Now, I said to some extent, suggesting that the world could be different has always been a part of philosophy and religion. In various figures like the Hebrew prophets suggested we should reorder society. Socrates, of course, spent his lifetime going around asking the question why, as to why things are the way they are. Confucius again suggested there's a better way to organise society, and if you like, through most religious traditions there have been traditions of monasticism to show, if you like, you can live in terms of that sort of poverty and interiority rather than sort of focused more on the outside world. However, I said we often sort of speak about a particular lineage of modern Western thinkers, I said, who have questioned our world and have spoken of as the masters of suspicion, or who have developed what's called a hermeneutics of suspicion. And I said this particular trio comes down from Paul Ricoeur, and they're Karl Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche. And essentially, if you like, Marx is sort of credited with coming up with the analysis that actually, if you like, the social, the economic, material world around us keeps us in bondage to the world, and this is sort of quite important. Particularly, like, in terms of religion, of course, his famous quote, religion is the opium of the people. So, the world is sort of created to stop us from seeing the harsh realities around us. Freud, as we briefly sort of mentioned yesterday, of course, but again, this whole kind of sort of tradition of sort of psychology, that up until sort of Freud, we assumed that people were sort of fairly easy to read, to understand in some ways, and he sort of showed, or started a tradition, that if you like, that a lot of our sort of most fundamental beliefs, our longings, actually sort of may have other roots behind them. And Nietzsche, again, sort of significant, particularly in terms of religion. I sort of a couple of things down here. I put down the immoral origins of morality, because part of sort of Nietzsche's critique, whereas people have supposed up until this time that, if you like, that Christianity, even if it wasn't true, taught a very good sort of set of moral codes, Nietzsche sort of suggested that actually it was a slave mentality. He developed this idea of the Uberman, sort of the Superman, who would sort of do whatever he wanted, and suggested that actually morality had been created, if you like, by the weak, to keep the powerful in check. So actually it was sort of stopping us from fulfilling what may be our basic sort of needs and wants. And again, sort of through him and also sort of other figures, I said the ideas of the truthfulness of God, of the way the world is, may be again based upon sets of sort of reality and untruth. I'll show you a short little clip from an American philosopher, Roderick, who speaks around this. And again, I've loaded this up first.
Now, or we suspect we know, that those belief systems have come considerable suspicion. Okay? Considerable suspicion. In fact, one of the legacies of the 19th century, and this is the title of my first lecture, which I'm just now getting around to explaining and trying to explain. The title of my first lecture is The Masters of Suspicion. It's a wonderful book called The Philosophy of Paul Ricoeur. Collects a whole series of articles by the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, and I'm not interested in all the articles. He has one in here about the critique of religion. And in it he mentions the three great masters of suspicion of the 19th century. And it's not merely their intellectual work that began to make us feel estranged and alienated and separated from the holy world of previous times, the world in which we could find our meaning in God or through His works. They reflect a sea change in the species view of itself. I would have included the name of Darwin, the first, to give a natural explanation of how we got here. To give, in the case of Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, the reason they're mentioned by Ricoeur is they raise a criticism that I personally don't see how any argument could get around. In a way, it's a counterpart to the believer's faith. Just like the believer's faith, even today in the late 20th century, if you want to hang on to it stubbornly enough, can't be shaken, although that's cold comfort, given that any belief you want to hang on to stubbornly can't be shaken. Sort of the nature of human beings to be stubborn, obdurate to reason, and so on. The suspicion they raise is much deeper, and I think Ricoeur puts them together well, because when you're faced, and you will be, at least in some exciting intellectual context with these critiques of religion, at first you will notice only the negative part. In other words, the destructive part of the criticism. And I'll run through them quickly. I mean, they can be run through quickly because these names, Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, even Bill Bennett agrees they're all classics. Okay, so we're not in here to convert anyone to any other new religion or anything. These are classics. They are, in fact, markers in our culture of this sea change I'm talking about. They put before us the problem of false consciousness, of the self being false to itself. That problem is one that religion was ill-equipped to deal with. Ill-equipped to deal with. As long as we could believe with Descartes that if we knew something clearly and distinctly, we knew it, we were okay. But then when the suspicion crept in from the direction of Freud that we could know something, but it would really be a forbidden piece of our sexual history, prohibited and thus channeled in another direction, that was bobbling out of our little lips, then, and that consciously we'd never admit it. I mean, I'm, by the way, not being a full-blown Freudian, I do believe sometimes pencil is just a pencil.
Okay, I will stop that there, the pencil just being a pencil. But basically his point as he makes it here, if I get back to where we were, is, as I said, that these sort of figures sort of, reshaped the world. Basically the 19th century sort of raised up a set of challenges towards religion, which I said certainly sort of Ludovic thinks are kind of insurmountable. Religion is impossible after it. Now whether that's true or not doesn't matter. Ricoeur himself, if he's quoted, is actually a very religious thinker himself. So certainly sort of people think that it is possible. But if you like, they started a way of thinking around a world that makes us challenge the naturalness of the world around us. It sets sort of a whole sort of series of sort of thoughts in place that perhaps we need to rethink again the way we look at ourselves, and a whole range of other figures could be added onto it. As Darwin, of course, he mentions as one, but also back in the 19th century, Feuerbach, who suggested that God was simply a human projection, could be added to this list. And more recently, figures like Foucault, who you may have come across. He's done a lot of work on what's called the archaeology or the genealogy of knowledge, about the ways that we sort of represent the world. We've got a sort of a history to show that Our ideas on almost sort of any idea sort of changed over time. And Jean-Francois Lyotard spoke about the end of sort of meta-narrative, so like ground pictures explaining things. Just a little note, I would also sort of perhaps talk about adding Kant to this list, who's sometimes seen as part of the problem. But to my mind, I mean, Kant was one of the first people who asked us to think for ourselves and told us that reason is actually sort of contingent. It is historically based. There's not this sort of ground thing called reason which is out there. But I said he is often sort of spoken against. But it's worth mentioning these figures first as part of the heritage, which leads us on to rethinking the world. So this, I said, brings us on to sort of thinking about the categories that we make, which brings us back to tomatoes. And for those of you who in the first session, of course, we spent a bit of time talking around the way we sort of create the world through categories within it. So if you like, the way we put things and how we divide our world may help shape our experience of this. I'd like to show you another little sort of video, which I think is a very good example of this. You may have seen this before. It's quite a recent one that's had quite a sort of a big presence around the web, but I think it does a fantastic job of showing how sort of a certain set of cultural assumptions and words actually has a very big effect.
Hi, Erin. Hi. Okay, so I'm going to just give you some actions to do and just do the first thing that comes to mind. Show me what it looks like to run like a girl. Show me what it looks like to fight like a girl. Now throw like a girl. Aww.
My name is Dakota, and I'm 10 years old.
Show me what it looks like to run like a girl. Throw like a girl. Fight like a girl. What does it mean to you when I say run like a girl?
It means run fast as you can.
So do you think you just insulted your sister?
No. Yeah, insulted girls, but not my sister.
Is like a girl a good thing?
Actually, don't know what it really, if it's a bad thing or a good thing. It sounds like a bad thing. It sounds like you're trying to humiliate someone.
So when they're in that vulnerable time, between 10 and 12?
I won't go through and show you the rest of this, but I think it's been a very clear point that, you know, young girls up to about the age of 10, 11 also do something like a girl, they do it naturally. But in our society, our assumption of what it means to do something like a girl is very different. Are women naturally less athletic than men? No? No. So why do we have this assumption? Why do we use this term? I know it's a very big question. But basically, if you like, you know, we have come, I said, to use certain words to mean certain things, and that, as you see, perhaps sort of shapes the way that people behave in certain ways. So I said, I mean, all this idea about actually hermeneutics of sort of suspicion, I think is very, very powerful stuff. You know, people sort of, you know, will live their lives and use it in all sorts of real ways. And I said it has sort of real effects in terms of what people do. Now, sometimes, if you like, effects is the way we shape our world. Is not always seen in such ways. I hope you've all eaten before coming here. I'm about to show you something. Now, what is that? Yes, it's food, but breakfast.
Diversity.
Well, diversity is, yep, certainly diversity there, but the answer I was looking for was breakfast. Now, what makes you think this is breakfast? Do you only eat eggs at breakfast? No? Sausages you only eat at breakfast? No? All of these things, they can only be eaten at breakfast, that's why you think it's breakfast? No. We eat them at any time of day. Yeah? So how do you know this is a picture of breakfast?
With the combination of certain food, that's what makes it. And the faculty are constantly eating this for breakfast.
Yes, yeah, so customers say sort of the habits sort of in there. So I said there's nothing here that naturally tells us that these are just meant for the morning. I certainly sort of know as you go around different parts of the world, you know, people go to other countries and they see what other people eat for breakfast and they just find it almost impossible to eat. It's one thing that people travel around the world have the hardest meal of the day is actually breakfast. You know, lots of people may love noodles, but give them a bowl of noodles at breakfast, and I may be made out, you know, Westerners, Europeans and Americans, and they will just look at you as if you're mad. So, you know, again it sort of shows we see bits of food, but we have these assumptions in our minds. These are the things, if they're in that particular order, which I have for breakfast. But why? I said it's not natural, it's not innate in the world, it's part of, if you like, our society and our customs and our cultures, that we shape our world in certain ways. There's certain things seem natural to us. This seems like a natural breakfast, that one doesn't seem like a natural breakfast, this one does, that one doesn't, and so on and so forth. Now, a couple of other sort of examples may be useful. I'd like to mention a very famous sort of psychology experiment conducted some time ago. I think these days nobody would get ethical clearance to do this. It was conducted back in the 80s, but on the first day, a group of third grade primary school children were put into two groups, the blue-eyed children and the brown-eyed children. And the blue-eyed children were praised. They were told they were more intelligent than the brown-eyed children, and they had encouragement from the teacher as well throughout the day. I said the brown-eyed children were rebuked and ridiculed during the day. Day two, this was reversed. So the brown-eyed children were praised and the blue-eyed children were put down. And the results of the experiment, very interesting. Each day, the children who were praised did better. So on day one, the blue-eyed children did better in tests, the brown-eyed children did worse. On day two, these results were changed. And also, it was noted that the behaviour changed. The normally sort of kind children in each group started being mean towards the other ones. So the blue-eyed children started picking on the brown-eyed children on day one, the brown-eyed children picked on the blue-eyed children on day two. Now, obviously, this is something that is, you know, I think part of an experiment. People knew that this was sort of just being done to test them, but nevertheless, their entire, if you like, way of life was changed. Even their performance was changed. I said because they were told they were more intelligent, the blue-eyed children on day one did better in tests, and the brown-eyed children did worse. So they became more or less intelligent, just based upon the fact that they were told that they were smarter, and the other ones weren't. So I said it shows how powerful, if you like, sort of language is in these cases. I've just taken another sort of bit of a quote here. It's a passage from a figure called Pierre Bourdieu, who's another sort of cultural sort of critic in this area. Hopefully not too small, I'll just let you read that. Okay, any thoughts, comments, questions at this stage? Okay. Well, I think sort of these kind of things sort of lead us into what is sort of known as the tradition of sort of social constructionism or critical theory, depending upon where you're looking at it. And one part of this is what is called sort of habitus by Bourdieu. It's basically about sort of, you know, the ways of life that we have, the structures that create the world for us. And there's another quote, it's quite a difficult one, so I'll take us through it. So, the conditionings associated with a particular class of conditions of existence produce habitus. So basically certain conditions will produce habits, these forms of life. So he calls them systems of durable, transposable dispositions, and then structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. Now, very similar bits of sort of language there, but the first bit, structured structures, tells us that this is something that we make. We create these structures, like the words do something like a girl. It's a humanly imposed idea. So we create a structure. Something sometime back in the past, in patriarchal societies, tells us that men are going to decide that women can't do things well. So they create the phrase, doing things like a girl. And this, I said, becomes a structure in the structure. The thing we've made actually changes us. It sort of affects the way we behave. Like the blue-eyed and the brown-eyed sort of children, we create a structure that the blue-eyed children are better. That then structures the blue and brown-eyed children in certain ways. So we have structured structures which make structuring structures. So that is as principles which generate and organise practices and representations. So as he says, we have these things and they then organise the practices, the way we behave, and also representations, the way we look at and respond to the world. That can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing conscious aims at ends. So the idea is it's not conscious, we don't stop and think about it. It just sort of happens automatically. Again, the blue-eyed children, after sort of a day of being told they were sort of smarter and better, they didn't think, oh, I'll go out and now sort of, mistreat some brown-eyed children. It just became part of what they did. It just became a natural habit to them. Like throwing like a girl. You don't stop and think, oh, how does girl actually throw? No, you just, it just comes out without thought. It comes without any conscious sort of idea. So it's express a mastery of the operations necessary in order to obtain them. So it's sort of, we have to, as I said, did this mastery of these forms of life. It's just part of who we are and how we behave. Now, to look at this, oops, it's not coming up. I said a scholar called sort of Martin has come up with what he lists as 7 sort of principles of social constructionism. So I said, firstly, words, tools that humans use to limit from the stuff of the world what is of interest to them. As in, we name sort of certain things, we don't name other things. I'm not sure if it's true. I'm told that certain groups of sort of Inuits have got 52 words for snow. And they can distinguish, if you like, between these things, because if you live in a world with lots of snow, it's maybe useful to say, what's the sludgy stuff, what's the firmer stuff. So, if you like, our words create the world for us, and of course they can distinguish between all of these things. I also understand there's another tribe in Africa who've got 7 words for green, and basically they can see lots of different shades of green that basically most of the people in the world can't, because they just see it and it's just a natural response for them. And I've looked at some of these pictures that meant to show these shades and they just all look exactly identical to me, which may be my eyesight, but I mean it's one of these things that our words are actually sort of allowing us to see certain things and not other things. So the tools we use produce the world for us. If we use a different set of tools, we would have a different world. So again, if we had these 52 words of snow, we would think differently about things. The uses of words are variable. So something like scripture, it means a different thing in a Muslim context, a Buddhist context, a Hindu context, etc. Variable uses of all we have. There are no intrinsically right or wrong uses of words, just different uses. Now, I said this is a basic point of sort of social constructionism. I don't necessarily agree with all of the implications of this, but I said it's part of the system, so people just do things in different ways, and that's the way it is. I said, although the uses of words change, this does not mean that anything is true. Whether a claim is true depends on the agreed use of the words for a particular sort of community. So, if I claim, I don't know, that Alami is king, it's only got a meaning if actually he has been sort of crowned and this was a monarchy where he could be sort of king. In this current context, it wouldn't have any particular meaning. So what we are assuming is a sort of product in the concepts and practices in our societies. So once again, our whole place, our position here is the context of these worlds we've created. So social facts, also social, and nevertheless real facts. If only the community recognises them as such. So I said, although this is put at all sort of social constructed, it has sort of real effects. So again, sort of the idea, you know, to be sort of the blue-eyed child in the class is a very bad thing if it's day 2. It's not just, you know, a random bit of stuff that could change, you know, it has very real effects on the people involved. Now we'll come back to these 7 principles in a bit to look at them. Before we do, we'll move on now specifically to religious authority. So I'd like you to do a little bit of brainstorming first. And as yesterday, if you want to get back into your boots and think, what sources of religious authority can you think of? Meaning, what is there that...
What sources?
Sources. So what type of things are there which, you know, provide authority within religious communities?
Text.
Scripture. Scripture. Symbols.
People themselves.
Organized.
Does it give the miracles of God or languages? Sometimes,
Prophets, messengers, they have sage, we have religious leaders, then we have scripture, we have
cups,
traditions,
That's-
right?
the brand.
We have wisdom, inspiration, that's all the process, right?
Yeah, administering the other one.
Institutions, yeah. Secret, I know secret can be anything, can be a tree, can be a river, can be a
But is there any other knowledge? Is a sacred tree?
Media, culture,
media.
Yeah.
I mean, if we don't know the tree is sacred, is that possible?
Maybe control.
But even if we don't know that the religious leader is an authority figure, he still might try to tell us and no.
So your point is how, is it?
Yeah.
Who gives it the special, the authority, yeah. And that's where the social construction, socially constructed by history, passed down, and tradition, yeah.
Even I think the context which is represented for a person within the religious sphere, if I as a Hindu, I might rely on, you know, the grandeur of the religious authority, but a person from outside the faith might just rely on a common as a religious authority. Like you are a Hindu, you might not just Jewish, though technically within the religious sphere she doesn't have authority. So, it changes inside and out.
Okay, have you got a type of list? Okay, what have you got? Good.
Traditions,
Traditions.
Religious leaders and institutions.
the sacred,
The sacred.
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 Genealogy, who they descend from.
Right. Okay. Is that part of tradition or is
No, this is a family.
a family? Okay.
And the descendant of.
Yes.
Given a certain authority.
Yes.
Descendant of the prophet.
Um,
Lineage, yeah.
yeah, lineage family.
And the caste also. Caste.
Caste.
Which caste they come from.
Okay.
The priestly caste.
Caste. So, which possibly, I mean, lineage you can also inherit a lineage as from some people as a teacher.
Also, it depends on whether
Symbols.
Symbols.
for whom, if you're outside the religion, anybody from the religion would be a source of authority for you. So that also depends.
Nice. So even if you come and ask somebody about that religion, then
You
yeah,
take
so
their word for it.
you take
and
their word
they-
for it. Okay, yes. Yeah, I was kind of thinking more within religions, but yes, that comes into it as well. So, yes, informs.
Language is actually not certain types of
Mhm.
language.
Yes.
Wealth.
Well, yes. I'm just putting this at the top because I flew out of space, so also that's maybe the most important. Okay.
Morals or
Morals. Usually in certain places, so many people behave well, it may give them certain authority. Okay,
miracles.
miracles. Okay, maybe that comes next to the sacred, it's some sort of divine event in some way. Okay, any other thoughts? No? Okay.
Now it's Google.
It's good. I have a list of sort of stuff I've suggested there, which overlaps with yours in various ways. So we all have scripture. I've put Revelation, which I guess links in with scripture, but also sacred and sort of miracles or something coming down. Reason, which is one you didn't put in, because of course it's certainly sort of, you argue, theologians, if you like, have authority through that. Experience, which does that come in? Possibly through biblical behaviour. People claim kind of a particular relation to this experiences. Tradition and lineage, which kind of overlaps with tradition, leaders, institutions, lineage, families, and stuff on there. Charisma, which often comes back, and it goes back to Max Weber, as you know, your sociological sort of theory, which again go into lineage and families. Of course, this is something that can be carried down in his usage. So, particular individuals, again, yeah, teachers, caste, all sorts of stuff there. Gender, I've thrown into, of course, while gender in itself may not give you authority, but gender is a part of authority in certain traditions or lack of it. Interpretation or hermeneutics, which possibly comes across what you put down here, sort of languages, world, it depends who's doing this. And knowledge, which possibly overlaps with sort of reason, but again, sort of separate, because you may just have certain knowledge. I said also added wealth on here, which of course is very true. And symbols, I think, as the extra sort of thing in there. So I'm just looking at a very wide range of different things, I said, which will counter sort of sources of authority. Obviously in some religions, not all of these are sources of authority. Sometimes obviously reason can be a reason why you don't have authority, as in somebody else has revelations that they know what's true, yours is based on arguments, so you're just making it up. So in different sort of places they all play out in different ways, because it's very, very diverse in terms of what it does. But I said in terms of sort of social construction, I said all of this is seen as sort of things that can be sort of read and understood as, if you like, sort of human products, which are part of the way we shape the world, and therefore sort of one group, if you like, asserts authority over another one. And Bruce Lincoln, a historian of religion in the United States, has summed this up quite well. I'm afraid that's a fairly long quote, but a very useful one. I said a few points worth picking out. I said the first one, as the first principle, like all other texts, those that constitute themselves religious are human products. So I said this comes as part of the scholarly sort of discussion on this. Nothing is sort of taken out as a sort of a sacred text. It's not revelation. You treat them all as human products. So like the academic study, and if you like the beliefs within a particular tradition, are always sort of distinguished on these points. I say always, of course, Confucianism doesn't have a problem with this. Confucian texts are seen as human sources, but generally, this is something that sort of separates them. As he then notes, sort of religious texts make sort of special claims for them, but he suggested like the exercise of the scholar is to ask sort of certain questions. So who is trying to persuade whom of what in this text? So I said you don't look necessarily at the religious sort of claims in it, what's the theology, but you look at the agenda behind it. So who is trying to influence who? So what context is it happening? So why is it sort of happening in this place? And what are the consequences should it succeed? Now, before we move on to our case studies, we'll look at a few bits in some more detail. I've just got a couple of sort of examples around sort of the way authority can sort of work in practice. And the first one, two little quotes from the New Testament. So I said they're both about the authority on Jesus' ontological status, or what he is. So read them and tell me what you make of them. Ontological is to do with the nature of being, so what something is in and of itself. Okay. What's the claim of the first quote?
What's the what?
The claim. What's it telling us about Jesus?
He's separate from God.
Hmm?
He's separate from God.
He's separate from God. Mm-hmm. And you know that?
With God working through him.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So he's separated from God. He's a man sent by God, but he is therefore just a human being. What about the second quote?
He no longer is just a person sent by God. He is the Son of God, and somehow that equals him. It gives him an equal status to God.
Yes.
So he himself becomes God.
Yeah, he himself becomes God. Okay. So, arguably, I say arguably because not everyone will agree with this, these are two contradictory statements in the New Testament about the nature of Jesus. So, assuming you were an Orthodox Christian theologian who believes that God is fully man and fully God, what do you do with these statements? The second one's probably not a problem.
Try to rationalize.
How to rationalise it?
And try to regularize.
Mm-hmm.
Make meaning, make sense. Yeah.
Okay, and any example of how you try and do this?
God is everywhere. And God is in us, and we are part of the whole divinity. You know, that Jesus is full of divinity, but not the totality of divinity.
Okay, that might be one possibility to it. Falls slightly outside an Orthodox, well, yes, he's not the totality of God, but you're maybe slightly downgraded in terms of the Orthodox tradition. But yes, and that would be one way to try and think about it.
Because when Mark says that I am the truth,
Mm-hmm.
he will not necessarily be wrong to say that, right?
Yes, he may have the truth, but yes. Yes. Okay, well, I said certainly what we sort of get out of this, I mean, I said orthodox theology will read this is basically a statement about Jesus' humanity. Of course, traditionally he's both fully human and fully God, and therefore they're both just talking about different bits of him, but it doesn't alter the question. But I said what is clear here is that a certain sort of scripture, if you like, read literally, has more authority than another one read literally. This one has become read in a different way because of this one. And it's like all of them, they're equally authoritative, all sort of parts of the New Testament and therefore sort of spiritual sources for Christians. But certain bits of it get read with a priority over other ones. If you were a slightly more critical historian, you might point out that this is probably a bit of earlier sort of source. Luke and Acts were probably sort of written first. It may well be a record of the earliest church's teaching. And John's Gospel is known to be quite a lot later. It's always been called a theological gospel, even by the church itself. So it makes all sorts of claims about Jesus, and therefore it is stuff that the church made up to fit in with its claims. But there's nothing Jesus ever said. And almost certainly as a historian, Jesus never said that. So you can make sense of it in various different ways. Thus it's about the way that if you accept all of the scripture, you prioritise certain bits over others. For certain agendas. I said next, I haven't got quotes here, but I said from the back of that each probably a book you're all sort of familiar with. As you know, it narrates the story between Krishna and sort of Arjuna. Krishna is of course God incarnate in this case, and Arjuna is the prince, sort of the warrior. And basically, as the book goes, Krishna explains to Arjuna his dharma, his duty as a Kshatriya warrior is to kill. But in part, this doesn't matter because death's not permanent, and so he's not actually killing these people or his family, his friends, his cousins. And so I said, on literal reading, the text seems to be a justification for war, or at least a just war in certain circumstances. Now Gandhi, of course, has totally read this as a pacifist manifesto. He explains the text as not being around war. Now, any sort of thoughts I've said around the Gita or sort of other texts, sort of religious texts, how do you sort of make something with one fairly clear literal meaning mean something else? Any thoughts?
War is not to kill for the sake of killing, or to get loot, or to get honor, or to get name. But you go to war and you kill for me. That's what God has said. Yeah. So in that sense, it is not killing as what we understand killing today, but it's an act of devotion, act of piety.
Yes. I mean, to fulfil your duty can be an act of piety, so you're not doing it with any anger, any aggression. Yeah, so that, as I said, you could be part of it. If you're meant to be free of anger, free of aggression, then maybe that will lead you to think, well, actually, you won't fight at all. So, yes, that's one way of taking the text.
War, good versus evil.
It is.
Fear of God over good over evil. So in that sense, yeah, the idea of just war.
Yeah.
Which is an accepted virtue,
Yes.
There's nothing to be ashamed of.
Yes.
And I think that is the basis of peace building in Hinduism. That's what Buddhists told us. Okay, I'm just getting what is next.
Yes. So I should say it could be a symbolic thing, so it's not a real war. He just tells about the victory of truth over evil.
I think along those lines as well.
Right.
How about to kill? Maybe it's to kill your own ego, your own anger, and not a physical person. And so then Gandhi could have used it as a pacifist.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So various ways I said into religions, and of course most religious traditions will tell us that their books also, if you like, have a a symbolic, a metaphorical, an analogical sort of reading to them. So you're not just meant to read them literally. Also, they will often tell us you do read them literally as well, but not just literally. So yes, various ways I said in which I said the authority of texts sort of changes. So I said in the first one, certain parts of text have more authority than other parts of texts, at least if read in a literal sort of sense. And again, another one which perhaps has got sort of one meaning. You understand the authority as something sort of deeper, beyond the literal sort of words of it. So, yeah, you can read these texts in various ways. Now, we'll come back to Martin's sort of 7 points about social construction. I'll just sort of run through a few bits in relation to this. So I said the words are tools that humans use to limit stuff in the world that is of interest to them. So again, words like sort of scripture, we apply it to those books we think we've got authority, and of course the books that we don't think of authority are not scripture. So each tradition, if you like, canonises certain texts. And if you know the history of the development of sort of the New Testament canon in Christianity, it started, if like, with one teacher saying, these are the texts which we accept, these are the authoritative ones, and then to go come and say, well, actually, no, we accept these texts. So it's basically kind of an argument over which bits you want. And again, in terms like sort of Christian or dhimmi. Dhimmi, I assume you all know, it's the people of the book from the Islamic sort of traditions. They've named sort of Jews, Christians and others. But of course, to name somebody a Christian or to name him a dhimmi carries all sorts of associations sort of with it. To be a dhimmi automatically puts you in a lower sort of social status than the Muslims, you're kind of positioned in relation to them. So I think the way we use these words affects what we think about people. Again, tools we use to produce the world for us. And this takes us back to session 1, so we mentioned it like the idea about what the word religion means. Does it mean piety? Does it mean books? Does it mean certain traditions? All of this is related into it. And because we didn't finish session 1, I didn't do my little bit around the Islamic term deen, which is often translated as religion, but probably, at least etymologically, it means nothing like the modern conception of religion. So if you read through the Quran of this related as religion, you get a very, very different sense from if you read it through sort of the traditional kind of etymologies around the word. Again, uses of words are variable, so revelation means different things in different contexts. So, if you like, in Islam, you have the Quran, it's the revealed sort of word, sort of text of God. If you come over to Hinduism, if you like, a different sort of set of texts, and of course the way they come down as sort of revelation is again slightly sort of different. They've been sort of sent down to the sages rather than passed through this one person. And again, of course, the term sort of prophet means very different things in different contexts. The Hebrew prophets, different from the Islamic usage about Muhammad. Again, variable uses, none of them intrinsically right or wrong. So if we define certain people as heretics, it doesn't sort of tell us, or at least if a scholar said they've got wrong belief, it really sort of tells us that one group doesn't like another group. Again, so in Buddhist terms, the Sangha, well, what does that mean in different sort of contexts? Is it the twofold Sangha of the monks and nuns, or is it the fourfold Sangha of the monks, the nuns, the laymen, and the lay people? So again, different contexts, different uses. I said again, use of words changes. I said it doesn't mean anything is particularly sort of true, but it's got a meaning in a particular sort of community. So again, particular traditions will vary. And again, the use of the Tao, classical sort of Chinese term used amongst the Taoist community, used by Confucians as well. Used by sort of, I said, lots of sort of different groups, and each one, there's a correct usage within that sort of group, but not overall sort of word. Again, what we're assuming is a result of the product of concepts and practice in our societies. So you can only be a priest in a religion which has priests. And of course, to become a priest may give you certain authority or power, which you have in some situations, but not in another sort of situation. And finally, I said, if you like, the social facts, which are real facts, I said perhaps a good example here, of course, Brahmins or Dalits. I said it's simply about the way the world is sort of socially constructed. But if, of course, you're a Brahmin, you're at the top of the tree. If, of course, you're a Dalit, then you're basically just there to be beaten or raped or killed or used however you wanted by the people at the top, which is sometimes how it works in practice, unfortunately. So if you like, I said, although it is just, part of the social construct, it's got very, very real consequences. So we'll come now back to our first case study, Mecca, Medina, minarets. Now, I will stand here to be corrected by my Islamic colleagues if I make any mistakes on this.
Before that, can I ask you a question? I think your earlier section shows the problematics of reading and understanding sacred text, because there's a lot of human agency involved, right? So when I read Fazlur Rahman commentary of the Quran, and a very nice little book on key messages or themes of the Quran, they start off by saying that before you even go into that, you have to understand what is the message. You just use the word the message. The message, that is what is God trying through all these texts, What does he want to communicate? So, and that message, which you read all the texts which can be seen to be contradicting to one another, to each other, or seem to suggest something negative, killing and bloodshed and so on. But you have to read it in conjunction with that message. So does it mean that sacred texts, there are many, the Vedas and the Sutras and the Quran and the Bible and the Torah, but this basically has to be linked to another sutra text, so to speak, which is the message.
Right. That's one way of looking at it. Of course, then your question is, well, whose super text is it? So what is that person trying to tell us with his super text? And, what are the effects if he's right? How does it control everybody else?
Right, in Singapore, you have the national, what do you call it, code of what, you always like to have this national ideology, what do you call it? Shared values, 1990s, shared values, then everybody will agree to this.
Yes.
That's all ideal.
Yes.
Global religion, right? That's moving towards that, trying to concept.
Yeah, some people certainly sort of move that. Well, I think it's very problematic because you'll never get everyone to agree on the same things. But of course, who benefits from the shared values is, of course, the PAP, the people in control. They are doing this as a form of sort of, social construction to make everyone be nice and obedient and obey them. That's the message we need to take.
Are you alright? Okay.
But that's what social construction does. Basically, everything is open to criticism in some way or another. So, I said we'll move on to this. Now, minarets, as I understand, they're technically not essential to a mosque. So you can have a mosque without them. I said so the early disputes as to whether they're necessary or not. I said it's basically the place in which the muezzin, is that the correct pronunciation? I said that's Muezzin. Okay. Does his call from prayer? Of course, does this need to be done from the roof or anywhere else? But I said they're often seen sort of defined in future. So certainly, sort of in the UK, or if you walk around sort of somewhere like sort of Turkey, every modern mosque has got a minaret because people just see it. It's just what a mosque has, and it's a mosque because there's a minaret there. And I said also they have, and they're not necessarily used. So again, in the UK, basically the call to prayer is normally sort of just issued within the main prayer hall because of laws around sort of noise and stuff like that. Now, there are different ways to interpret these. In fact, there are spiritual or religious interpretations. So, I said, perhaps a mosque has its position to communicate its respect and piety. Of course, it is the big, tall building so everyone can see it. So the fact that it's the big, tall building shows you how important Islam is. I said people may also suggest it reaches out to God. Of course, these pillars rising up to the heavens shows the link between man and God, the axis mundi, the centre of the world, if you like. And again, Muslims may talk about the story of sort of Bilal. He's the person I believe who gave the call to prayer of Muhammad rising up to the highest place, and so you're kind of sort of representing again, if you like, the lifetime of the Prophet. through building these minarets. However, it's not the only way to read it. And of course, different people would have their own sort of readings of them. Freud, obviously, would have something to say about minarets, which we possibly don't need to go into at the moment. The Marxist reading, we could go into power structures and authority. There's, of course, you know, you're constructing this sort of this big building which gives a sense of authority to it and empowers these ideas. And figures like sort of Foucault, when you talk about sort of surveillance and domination, so if you like, you have this sort of central thing. If that's there, you're always seen by the mosque. It's the tallest thing. God can always see you. So there are different ways. Panopticon, yes. Is the thing. So this, I said, sort of comes back, but I'd like to take us into a little bit of sort of history of how they developed. So I said the minarets are developed by the earliest sort of caliphs. And the Umayyad sort of caliphs built huge new minarets over the Prophet's mosque in Medina. Now why is this new sort of dynasty building these? And it suggested that basically it's a sign of how the Prophet's other followers in Medina. Medina, if you like, was one of the centres of source of resistance sort of against them. You didn't see them as sort of valid, and so you build these here to show your strength, to show your stability. And of course, they then associate themselves with the Prophet's mosque, so it helps to give them divine legitimation. Under the next dynasty, one of the Sabbid caliphs, Al-Mahdi, he shortens these minarets in Medina and builds heightened and slender ones over the mosque in Mecca. But again, their claim to be the new sort of regime is that basically they're going back to Mecca, the true centre of the religion, and therefore they associate themselves with that, and of course they show their power by having the tallest minarets in the world, the ones that they've built. So you look down the other ones. So all of this, I said, is very much about this sense of sort of power being developed. Now, all of this sort of continues. The next bit, this goes back to something that Rosalind sort of told me about when he last went to Mecca, that basically they've knocked down sort of lots of the old sort of buildings, and basically it's all been sort of modernised around it, which he sees as part of their sort of Wahhabi thing, that tradition is meaningless, so the source of authority comes out of other places. And of course recently, Swiss has sort of banned the building of sort of new mosques and new minarets within their country. And of course, sort of why? And a lot of the pandemic around this seems to be very much concerned not with mosques themselves, but with minarets, the site, if you like, of these un-Christian, un-European sort of things over the Swiss landscape. So basically, sort of always, I said, debates around sort of minarets. None of them, I said, about the religious sort of aspects of it. It's always around, basically, I said, you know, the use of sort of power. Lively displays of power, sort of bigger, taller, wider. And so if you want Islamic scholar, the suggested tall enough sustainable buildings are incompatible with the prophetic ideal of simplicity and moderation. So I said a lot of this, again, perhaps it's not actually religious sort of aspiration here. Now, just to come on to a discussion around this, I'd like to take us to two particular examples just before we get there. A couple of authors to make different buildings represent legitimacy or authority. And I said, what their roles in prestige, truth or acceptance? And of course how, and these are texts, don't forget texts are not just books, so we're reading these buildings as texts. How I said, do they create a habitus? How do they create a natural world in which we live? And two examples, one of them, Hagia Sophia, I'm sure you're all familiar with this and something about its history, so I'll just leave that there. Just one, not an Islamic example, it's a Hindu one. The Swaminarayan Mandir. I mentioned the Swaminarayan sect the other day, but here I think we see a slightly different sort of issue. That what I said when this built was the largest stone-built traditional sort of Indian sort of temple outside of India. So, if you'd like to look into groups and sort of think about what kind of sort of legitimacy or authority comes through these sort of builders, and I said also, go back to issues like the minarets, what does that tell us? Is it a religious dispute? Is it about sort of power? And how, if you like, is prestige, truth, acceptance mediated through the use of buildings? if you want to discuss amongst yourselves, if you
Just one comment about the minaret and the dome. Syed Hussein Nasar wrote a very good chapter. Syed Hussein Nasar is a very prominent Islamic scholar. Is he still alive? He's still alive. He's in Shia and Washington University. So, beautiful chapter on describing the architecture of the mosque. And his explanation of minaret and dome, very interesting. He thought that God wanted to be fair to both men and women. You know, and he's explained it, you know, and this is in the chapter, not from me, that the minaret is the masculinity, you know, symbol, and the dome is feminine. It's in that chapter, and not me. So it's a balance, you know.
yin and yang.
Huh?
Yin and yang.
Yin and yang, okay. Well, the other one is you know, the minaret is meant when in the early days, somebody will climb up 5 times a day to say the prayer, call to prayer. Because it's high, right? So people can hear at a distance. And apparently in Bosnia, which I'm going, you know, in May, they're still doing it. You know, so I want to see how they do it. Somebody climb and say the call of prayer, and he will do it. He will move, you know. Call prayer is few verses, right? And it take about a few minutes. So he will move around to them. Yeah. So it's a 360 degrees kind of thing. Yeah.
With regards to the minaret, I always believe that systematic theology and philosophy develops later in Islam. So the 9th, 10th century, when the dynasties were established. Because the earlier part of Islam is very much political, in the sense that they were schisms and they were fighting against each other in order to establish authority. And therefore, in the case of the construction of the mosque, it's very much embedded in the political culture of that time. And you're right that the minarets first emerged during the Umayyad period, later on the Abbasids. It's because the mosque was a central feature of governance. It started from the Prophet, whose house was connected to the mosque. And the mosque has a pulpit, which became a kind of a place where he gave commands and edicts and all that, and the community will gather with it. So a mosque is actually a political structure as early in Islam. And having that minaret is important because the whole community is organized around a mosque. If you see in all these ancient cities, let's say in Cordoba, the great mosque of Cordoba was the center of administration for the Umayyads. Similarly in Damascus, the great mosque of Damascus. So the whole city planning was actually built around the mosque, and the mosque was kind of like a community center where the caliph will often come and address the people. And having tall minarets is functional because people coming from far will see that as a center of administration and head towards them. And it also allows them to, like Foucault's panopticon, to keep a surveillance of the entire city. And that's why Mawardi, for instance, in one of his classical texts, states that no non-Muslim buildings can go higher than a Muslim building. And the minaret is a representative of the highest structure in the administration. Yeah. In fact, this became an issue because in Malaysia, for instance, some of the extremists were arguing cannot allow a church to go higher than a mosque and things like that. So I think it's very much political. Yeah. The idea of like Syed Hussein Nas coming in and theologizing it came later, when you try to make sense of it later on. But the earlier part was strictly functional. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Do we have to put the slide back in?
Yes.
You can talk yourself to this where you come with and munch. Yeah, okay. So what's the question?
religious people.
We say justify,
Yes.
justify to right.
Justify the authority or justify the power and legitimize,
Yeah, but the social dimension of it is not so much used for social gatherings unless the caliphs call the people and there's an address or things to be said. The more communal aspect is actually at the marketplace, which is normally organized near the mosque. So the bazaar, for instance, at the mosque. I mean, at least in Islam, I'm not sure about this.
the whole thing that if you go in, you must be dwarf,
Yeah,
you must be squat. That's why you go to the mosque, church, even Quora, when you go up to see everything, because the dome is meant to give it the height, the depth of the modern sense. So it's, I think, it's more like authority.
But architecture is also contextual. Some of the mosques in China looks like temple.
So it's not.
There's no definitive architecture. So like sometimes I question because it is Islamic architecture, what is Islamic? This is the problem here in the Sultan Mosque. The original Sultan Mosque it's a Malay design, a Nusantara design.
I think there are like a lot of reasons. You have to make a lot of effort to go to the temple. Like the idea of being a god, it should be a journey.
Make a new one. So they call it the old they got the architect from
So many levels which
and his imagination of Islam is what he's familiar with, the Moorish culture, the Middle East. So that's where the dome and
I was there and I tried climbing a few about
the dome is quite a common feature in the Middle East. But the mosque here, the early mosque,
1237
see one of the earliest mosques in
Thailand. Yeah.
the mosque in Java. Forgot what it's called.
what role do they
The Mat Mosque. And it's a multiple tiered roof. It's not a joke.
prove or acceptance?
Today people complain, when it's school, it looks like community center.
Same thing in the Muslim world.
The crescent line, the moon and the crescent and the sun. That was the only period.
Because
It was never the part of Muslim
So how did it come about?
that should be the Al-Aqsa
They use the symbol to
Jerusalem.
it's a symbol for the Ottoman Empire.
Al-Aqsa was both the King Hassan Mosque. Fantastic, so huge.
Because there's a long tradition, so people get accustomed to it. So the moon and the moon is the last standing Muslim empire.
What a waste, you know.
The Polish.
But it was a
So
symbol
all the
of
Qataris are building.
Yeah, especially for the army.
I mean, it's all
It was a prestige, so they need a symbol of government.
Yeah, prestige, not prestige.
No,
Mine
because
prestige, but
it's a symbol of Islam. It was never in early
man's
Islam.
prestige. It's all about power.
So you see, ISIS, they don't use that.
Yeah, they were new symbol.
Power.
I mean, they just have a black flag, Arabic La ilaha illallah. Because to them, the Prophet used that in the prophetic period.
The circle is actually also from the prophet's shoes. I got this one wrong.
Circular shape.
Yeah, it's a circular shape on the black flag.
The full moon.
Not the full moon, the first one with a white background. It's all black and then with a white circle in the middle.
Right? And then
Would you actually build
And then other
huge religious structure structure, if you were just beginning to establish yourself, I would assume that it's only once you establish yourself
You mean
have
that?
a sense of security that would you want to project yourself. Like for example, if you're a persecuted community, your religious symbols might be smaller, norm that like that's how I feel. I think once you have that status in society, you want to reinforce that. That would be the methodology, maybe.
The thing is that in Sri Lankan
But the kings already had that authority, right? So it's not that a monk came and built a huge. So the king already has the authority. If you look at Odisha, if you look at the Buddhist structures, initially are very small. The one that Ashoka built is very different because he already has the authority. So I mean, when you're establishing a religion, like if a religion is coming in, then you would not, I mean, I assume it would not be a very huge thing. It's only under the protectorate of a particular person or when the religion is, at a certain secure state of mind, then will you exhibit it? Otherwise, you don't want to be at the center of all attack. That's how I would go about it. That's how.
So I think it's all about the dynamics of how religion in the world is. It's all about people, about the structure of authority, and how those with power use religion to legitimize their relations with power.
For example, the Swami that I it's huge, but like, I would assume that in the 18th century, the 19th century, the few Indians who were there would have built
religious authority combined.
I don't remember.
And then the need to use symbolic
Yeah.
religious symbols to demonstrate their power or glory. So that
It's only
Christianity
once
became
it's a huge immigrant population and
part of
economic.
the empire.
They do have that, are they able or capable, and not just like in monetary terms, but as an influential group.
See, the churches are so magnificent, everything is back in gold, huge structure, and it's amazing. It's because of the
symbols of
political power, and religious authority is subsumed as part of that political power.
It's a sacred space, as we discussed earlier.
If they need that history as well, maybe that country has
It's a medium to convey
religious authority that
messages.
Singapore, no. Yeah, but you see that, for example, in religions.
Okay, are you all ready to come together to discuss? Yes.
So when the political leaders see themselves as patron of the religion, the first thing they do is they
Okay, well, now have two groups together and see where we've got to.
This article also shows that how it is supposed to be single.
Okay, this is the traditional sharing time where you share your thoughts with each other. So, anyone want to? Ellen, you're trying to say something.
Oh, actually I was going to say that I think on our side Imran spoke the most, then on the other side I heard Akansha the most, so maybe they should be ourselves. They could start off.
That sounds
Yeah, we share.
Because we spoke about how the moment you enter a lot of these huge spaces of whether it's a mosque, a church, a gurdwara, we started off by talking about the acoustics and how the voice kind of resonates inside. So the idea is for from the pulpit or podium where voice is supposed to travel in a way, and the way it's structured as a human, when you enter that space, the idea is for you to feel very, very dwarf. Like you realize how small a person you are, how small an organism you are in this entire structure that God has created. So that is one thing that we spoke about. The role that they claim to play, I think we tended to go more towards prestige, especially when it comes to establishing the religion, and not just for the religion but those connected. So like we were talking in the Sri Lankan context, the kings want to, it's like one-upmanship and at the same time establish their authority. So that is the other thing that I spoke about, also about how the fact that eventually a lot of these institutions become these grandeur representations also shows at where does the religion stand? Like, as a community, you feel safe, as you feel secure. You have that status in society. For example, if you're a persecuted minority community, you might not be able to exhibit the same sort of wealth or like power, because the majority community or the stronger dominant community will not allow for that. And how do these texts create?
Basically how a sacred space represents a heaven on earth, basically the kind of place where you can go and connect with the divine as a representation of the godly.
What I disagree, there's nothing in sacred text that God or the Lord has commanded for such places to be built on earth. So,
not in all of them. The temple in Jerusalem is direct instructions on how to build
God
it.
does not command that the structure must be in a certain way, certain
It does.
depth or certain.
It's got to be exact measurements for it, and tells you what to use to build it.
This is
The temple in Jerusalem.
in the Torah.
Yes. Well, yes. They're very precise measurements, so that's how, when the time comes, they know how to rebuild it.
Yeah, but is that statement specified in the text, or is it it's an interpretation by?
It is in the, well.
This is also in
yes,
Islam.
it's in the text.
Also,
so
when they say Mina, the Arafah, it's a certain boundary, that you have to be in that piece of land. But it's all human.
Yeah, it gives the measurements, but of course, whether this was just saying what they did build, as in they're telling you how big it is, or whether they're telling you what God commanded you to build, I think that becomes a little bit unclear. I mean, it's certainly read as this is what God has commanded, but it's probably just people saying, look, well, in fact, it's built and it's built.
So my point is, these are all human constructions,
Yes.
It's the imagination of human beings who serve their interests and a certain specific purposes. That's that's where I see it.
Okay.
In Islam, there is a verse in the Quran that says that the whole earth is a mosque. Right?
Yeah.
The whole surface of the earth, that is, you can pray anywhere. You don't need a building. In that sense, I can pray even on the road or on the pavement. Yeah, that's our definition of a mosque.
The word masjid, mosque, comes from the root word sajada, which means a place of prostration. Like Mr. Alami said, there's nothing in Islam that stipulates it has to be big and all that. So if I can start from the other way around, it's the habitus that actually shapes our imagination that a mosque has to be grand and all that. And then we try to rationalize it by saying, oh, because of the glory of God, blah, blah, blah. Whereas actually, the early beginnings, it's, for me, because I come from the tradition of the masters of suspicions, it's highly political. How it become grand and big. For example, when I visited the Andalusia and went to some of the churches and mosques, it's really grand, decked with gold and high structures and huge. It's because the churches there, first the Visigoths actually ran over the whole entire Europe continent, and then they converted to Christianity, and then they began to rule. So it's always the mixture of political rule that appropriates a religious authority, and then the need to show their dominion by building grand structures like that. Similarly, when Islam actually defeated the Visigoths, they built huge mosques within the mosque, within the church complex. And then when Isabel and Ferdinand took over the Muslims, they built big churches, to replace the
I guess Sophia is a symbol of that. It changed hands, between the Muslims and the Christians. The first thing when the Christians conquered or took power, to change it to make it a church, and the Muslims took over, conquered, change it to a mosque. So that's very symbolic in that sense. So it's all about power play.
And particularly to its role, because it was often the sort of Constantine city, it's the capital city of Rome, and therefore it is the church of Christendom. So it's symbolic. I think that's, and also I suggest on the Swaminarayan sort of temple as a point, I think you lot were kind of vaguely discussing around this at some point I sort of overheard. But obviously, as I do feel the Hindu community in the UK, up until this time, this particular community had basically just been in sort of like some old sort of warehouses, and they'd been using sort of old sort of, churches which weren't in use anymore. So then something to build this, it's telling you all sorts of things. I mean, one, you make out it's a very big Hindu community there, but of course also they're saying, we're here to stay. We're a part of, we're part of Britain. We're not still immigrants who are just here temporarily. It's a statement that we belong here. That we're going to sort of be here for thousands of years. So again, very important for the community, but it tells us something about their attitude to the
Are those the flags of the Union Jack?
No. Hindu flags. It's also worth mentioning this particular sect is the smaller of two sects within Swaminarayan. They split up in 1905 into two different groups. And this is the smaller one, but they're a lot richer than the bigger group. So they've got these magnificent temples all over the world. They've now got them in Houston and Dallas, and there's a massive one in Delhi. It's one of the biggest temples of all of India. Have you?
Is it the Aksharam temple?
I'm not sure what it's called. I don't know what they call it, but it's from Swaminarayan group. I've seen some pictures of it. They've got kind of life-size elephants basically carved around the base of it. And you see people there, and then this is the base, and then the temple's on top of this. It's absolutely yes. So, again, it's positioning themselves as if not just here, but globally as, a major force within Hinduism.
Usually, construction of a mosque is also because of patronage. You see, in Malaysia, political authority built big mosques to show, and then it's named after a certain individual to show their patronage over it.
Yeah. Well, this one came out of the community itself, so it's all kind of, built through donations, and the community itself, basically sort of worked to build a garden and employ people.
The new mosque, the newest mosque in Singapore will be named after the first president, Yusof Ishak Mosque.
If you don't, like the Saudis, what they did is they call themselves guardians of the two holy mosques that secures their authority over Saudi Arabia.
Yes, and then gives them some kind of authority across the Muslim world.
Yes.
Well, they would think so anyway.
Yes.
Okay, we've got where we need to be on this. If you want to take a break, we'll come back to the next case study, where we'll look at the Lotus Sutra. That's a different kind.
Yeah, I know. The better one too. Yeah.
Construction now, the architecture. Is there any policy?
Thank you. Thanks. Yourself?
Before that,
You want to?
you study. report job. We're losing the essence of Morse now. That's very mechanical, very weak and mortar kind of thing. So I think this will go back to basics. How we started. In fact, mortar is the sense of spirituality, openness. Yeah. So I think many. So we did that for the Mongol mosque Islam. After that, I think I saw the last model because
I've not seen that. But do they bring back the Nusantara design? I think we need to connect back with that history.
I think for to shut the Nusantara and part of the Malay origin.
So the last one was Darul Aman, right? Yes.
Well, of course, Faiz from the Rakam objected. And one also before all this, not the Nusantara and the Malays.
But the book is not Islamic, but it's Arab, Moorish.
Objected to the old rationale and the Nusantara.
The mosque in China looks like a temple.
It's true.
तुम्हारे पेट भूखे तुम्हें वो मिलता है कुछ अभी भी मतलब कन्याओं के होता है तुम अभी तक नहीं होता यार कितने पैसे लगे थे यार
What language are you using? What language? Hindi.
Secret language. You study Hindi in school?
I did.
You have to go to a center, right?
Yeah.
That's special.
It was every Saturday. So like during the mother tongue period in school, we'd be free.
Oh. So you have to spend like at least half a day or the whole day.
Do they offer other than Hindi, like
Yeah, they
Urdu?
offer Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Bengali, and Gujarati. Tamil is in school.
Oh.
That's like part of the.
Because right now the Indian community, 50% is not local born,
Yeah.
and many of them from North India. So the teaching of Tamil in school now is.
Fortunately, it's.
I hope they are studying the situation and seeing how to, you know.
I mean, some schools have Hindi teachers. So like some primary schools and a few secondary schools, you can take your Hindi classes in your own school, but
Okay.
mine didn't.
Do you know, like, the take-up rate? I mean, some families, it's more convenient, okay, let's just take them off. Instead of going to the center.
I know for North Indians, they're very particular. They don't see the use of advantage of learning Tamil. Because in India, it's a very small proportion.
Southeast.
Yeah. I know like a few South Indian, like Tamil speaking families, they send their children to Hindi classes at Hindi schools.
I think we should have a third language policy across board. Some schools already implement third language. So trilingualism.
But then there are some who don't bother, they'll just like put their kids into Malay classes
Yeah,
instead of
because
Tamil.
it's easy.
Like
So
my
called,
sister did Malay, actually her A-levels in Malay.
Oh.
Yeah, there are a lot of families like that.
I think more Malay families wanted to send to Mandarin classes because of the economic power behind it. You know. It should be made available, so that the three language policy
But you know, after the passing of Lee Kuan Yew, I'm not sure whether would there be anything for our language policy. For he was the one who was so strongly behind it. You know. But that's not many, but not all, you know, in government, in the bureaucracy, who believes in this, you know.
It's actually a continuation of his policy, right? It's not, I mean, he believes in bilingualism, right? English is still the main language, but here we're just extending, instead of just your mother tongue, you also have another option, so that you can communicate interculturally, not just within your own.
But it's not per se, you know, language, right? It's deeper than that. All these things. It's identity, you know. It's culture, it's identity, it's very political. So in fact, people who objected it, who were not happy, including minorities, thought that this departure of the whole Singapore project, you know, because of China. I think it changed after he met in Taipei in the 1978 first meeting. After that, he started rethinking, you know, Singapore. It cannot be Singapore. Cannot be, you know. It has to be.
It makes sense because India is also a rising power. So we learn Mandarin, we learn Hindi maybe. I mean, more languages better, right?
And they are difficult languages, you know, like Chinese, it's not easy, and the Indian languages are difficult too. Okay, you're from India, so you
This is an insider outside.
Then all the more we should know.
Good.
Hindi actually is not a language difficult language. Like Hindi, Sanskrit, Arabic is better.
Arabic.
Although I feel Mandarin is more difficult than Arabic.
Yes, it's in the public domain. I was just looking through this
Because I
this
tried
morning.
learning both,
There's
and
website.
I feel Mandarin is
Because of the tone.
That's exactly.
It's like, you know
I
that.
still can't tell them apart.
Yeah, I was just looking on the
Yeah, I think
papers of the
Hindi and all
reception. I
that should
thought
be
it
a
was
little bit closer.
Because it's phonetics. You just follow the sounds.
Mandarin is very alien.
It's
Yeah.
Paul's article came out.
Oh,
The-
okay, right.
Paul's article about Kelly.
Did they tell you beforehand?
No.
I was just browsing through this when I first came in, and I thought, that's familiar.
Do they pay you?
No.
You think they should do?
They have a standing arrangement.
Oh, with
SCFD,
RSIS.
yeah, have a standing arrangement.
Or if they solicit direct from you,
This today, just so it's today.
this one they cross from RSIS.
Straits Times. That's great. I got paid for my article.
Oh.
Straits Times.
For your RSIS,
Definitely strict.
Yeah.
they republish and they get paid.
I think,
Then you just but how much?
whatever stock
It's just token.
in our size.
Is it after or before? Thanks.
This article was republished and you got paid.
What's that?
So
I
no
think
problem.
all should go and ask them. Am I going to be paid for this? But I guess if they specifically asked you for an article, then they might give you. But they have arranged with RSIS to just leave commentaries and reprint them.
In that case, I don't think they pay. In that case, I don't think they pay.
Yeah, if they just take from RSIS
Yeah.
and under the arrangement, they will pay.
Although it's slightly changed on its wording, I've noticed.
Title they change it, right?
No, I've still got the titles read there, but then they put their own.
Did they edit any of it?
Well, they've just slightly changed little bits of the wording around.
Uh-huh.
I had ISIS and Daesh, and they've taken that out of the Islamic State all the way through,
Oh,
which I purposely not put in there.
Singapore media uses IS rather than ISIS.
yeah.
I think the US uses ISIS.
Yeah,
changed
so
it.
I see.
Because for me, I have a arrangement with Chon Lee-Hoon, Straits Times, so that when I do, I give to her, I give to RSIS.
Oh, okay.
And then, yeah.
Then there's like Probably like Mr. Barry Desker's arrangement, because sometimes his articles come out in ST first, then RSIS picks them up.
And because I think they paid me, you know, the article, what, $300 a piece.
Oh, I thought there would be more. I mean, for the effort that, you know, it takes to write.
This one is 200. Today is 200.
Oh, is it?
Retirement can forget that. 100.
100.
Really?
Yeah.
But
Authentic.
it
They're so sticky with, they practice a lot of editorial involvement.
Okay. So, we'll come on to look at the Lotus Sutra. Now, those of you not familiar with it, it's one of these sort of main Mahayana sort of texts, so Mahayana sort of Buddhism. As its full title, it's the Saddhamparika Sutra, the White Lotus to True Dharma, but basically always put down just a Lotus Sutra. I said it's one of the most influential texts in East Asian Buddhism. I said it's fairly early, it starts to be written down amongst the Mahayana texts, and possibly around about the 1st century BC or CE. It's formed, but then sort of variants we have around. Like all sort of Buddhist texts, it's seen as something that's preached by the Buddha, and this of course gives it legitimation. And I said part of it is the place to Theravada school, the Hinayanas that will term it, into the Mahayana, so it creates this notion there's just sort of one school of sort of Buddhism, but of course this is the true version of it. I said it's both a philosophical and devotional sort of text, so it kind of sort of gives some philosophical underpinning to Mahayana doctrines. But I said it's also a devotional text, and there's a lot of sort of ideas taken out of here. And I said the text is certainly sort of taken up, and works of art sort of produced from it. And it's also used as an icon, or like as a religious sort of artifact in its own light. On a few major sort of points of it, I said it uses a lot of imagery and paragraphs, and this is partly why it becomes so popular. I said certainly for sort of producing works of art and stories. I said it also champions the idea of bodhisattvas, which of course are a key part of the Mahayana teachings. And in particular, there's a whole chapter devoted to Avalokiteshvara, who in sort of East Asian sort of Buddhism becomes the Chinese Guanyin, Japanese Huanon, as if like the most significant sort of devotional figure of East Asian Buddhism. It also teaches around skillful means, and there's a famous story about the burning house. But basically there's this father who comes out of his house and realises it's on fire, and his children are sort of left inside sort of playing. So he basically sort of tells them that he's got sort of fantastic gifts for them, and so the children come running out, and although he doesn't have anything, basically this is kind of sort of justified, that if you like, the Buddha can take things which aren't necessarily true if it leads people onto a higher truth. So it's kind of like different sort of levels of truth that what is sort of taught within this. I said it also teaches that the Buddha is a celestial manifestation, so the human sort of figure of Shakyamuni is not a human at all, but basically a manifestation of the Dharma come down to earth. And I said also that big sort of innovation is that basically you need to have faith in the sutra itself, that even just hearing this text is what can sort of take you on towards sort of enlightenment onto nirvana. So I'll show you three little sort of just snippets taken from the text or ways can be used as sort of examples. And I said one was around gender, authority and liberation. And I said important text here is the Dragon King's daughter to Naga princess. I said this one's about perceptions on gender. I said the third one concerns Avalokiteshvara. So I said this text is either known as the Dragon King's daughter or the Naga princess, basically because there are snake spirits in Indian mythology called Nagas, and it's originally written in Indian context. However, it's often translated out of Chinese, where the snake spirit becomes a dragon. So we have these two versions of it. Basically, in it, this young girl, this young sort of princess, basically just has one sermon from the Bodhisattva Manjushri, and she gains an incredible level of attainment. Basically, she's on a point of enlightenment, a point of nirvana, just after hearing one sermon about the Dharma. And people are suspicious about this, so they question as to how this is possible. And importantly, into questioning, she's not questioned about her species, which is a naga. Normally it's only considered humans contain enlightenment, but this doesn't seem to worry anyone. She's also not questioned about her age, which is 8. She's 8 years old. But nobody seems particularly worried that an 8-year-old can get to this attainment. What does seem to worry them is the fact that she's female. And into questioning, Shalaputra says the following. What is the reason? A woman's body is filthy. It is not a dharma receptacle. Now, Shalaputra is one of the sort of major figures in the early sort of Buddhist texts, one of Buddha's early followers. He doesn't always get a good image in this, but I said here he sort of seems to represent the major point of view. And she responds, it doesn't sort of matter about my gender, but nevertheless, as the story goes on, basically to attain enlightenment, she makes herself appear in another sort of realm. There she changes into a man, and upon changing into a man, then she attains awakening, enlightenment. So basically, like the patriarchal structure is sort of maintained, that yes, women can become very advanced, but only a man can attain awakening. And generally, I said the text continues sort of typical ideas on gender. So in the various sort of ideal realms, the realms that got
Sorry, possible that? Yeah. Try it.
Let the sutra, the later sutra. Yes, this is one of the texts.
Women cannot attain the Buddha, the Buddha status, is it?
In the early Buddhist texts, it's very clear that men and women can both attain enlightenment. I mean, this is very clear from the early texts. However, as the tradition continues, it tends to become accepted that women can't. And certainly, I mean, that is what you'd get from this reading of the Lotus Sutra, that she appears as a man first, and then she can go on to attain this. But yes, I mean, as in the early Buddhist texts, and as far as we can work out, the Buddha's teachings himself, it doesn't matter what the gender is. But I said, after about 400 years, it seems to have become accepted that only men can get there. So I said, in order to ideal, as I said, to places where the Buddhas are teaching, there are no women in any of them, and the text makes it quite clear there are only men in these realms. I said the lists of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and all the sort of worthies are male, and only 2 women get mentioned in the text, who are the Buddha's mother and his wife. And they basically come at the end of the list of those people who have future enlightenment. And obviously this gives them the chance to have a new incarnation as a man first, and hence why they can appear on the list. So I said it's a very, very patriarchal text. But something interesting I said happens in relation to Avalokiteshvara. I said it's very important. Bodhisattva, as it tells us in this text, in this book, the first time this appears, that a bodhisattva can appear in various forms, that either as a man or a woman. So it tells us that if somebody's seeking enlightenment and they need a monk to appear, he'll appear as a monk. If they need a nun to appear, he'll appear as a nun to them. And there are various sort of texts that expand on this later. Basically, the bodhisattva can appear as anything, as kings, as beggars, even as prostitutes. Basically, whatever will be suitable to people of enlightenment, this is the form it can take. But I said it's only sort of portrayed like as an idea. But I said it does lead on to the general sort of Chinese representation of Guan Yin in female sort of imagery and form. Sometimes it's a bit kind of sort of gender neutral, as in this sort of statue here. You all recognise this one? Yeah, some of you know that it's in the back of the Buddha Tooth Temple in Chinatown. And in China it becomes associated with the Miao Shan legend. Now, Miao Shan is a princess. She wants to become a nun, but her father sort of says no. She keeps insisting, so he gives her to the monastery, but tells sort of the abbess that he has to give her all of the worst jobs. So she decides she doesn't want to become a nun after all. So she's set to work in the kitchens, but being this type of sort of dragon comes along and helps her out, so she actually has a fantastic time there. So in the end, her father decides to burn the monastery down. So he burns the monastery down, but the dragon helps her escape. And she goes off to the mountains and there sort of practices her asceticism and becomes a great sort of figure. Now, a few years later, her father is very ill, and basically all the doctors are called, all the sort of holy men, nobody can heal her. And one of his advisors comes to him and says, there's only one person who can heal you. There's this holy man living up in the mountains, and he's the person we have to sort of go and see. And of course, the king doesn't realise that it was actually his daughter. So he sends a messenger up there to sort of ask for her healing, And she says there's only one thing that can heal this. The holy person will have to sort of give him her hands and her eyes so that she can sort of be healed. So she gouges her own eyes out and gives them to the messenger, chops one of her hands off, gets the messenger, chops her hand off. He takes these back to the king. These are made into a medicine, and then the king is healed. To show his thanks, the king then comes up the mountain, and of course at this stage he realises this is his daughter, and in the final act she basically self-immolates, she sort of sets on fire, turns into a man, and becomes the Bodhisattva Guanyin to show that basically that she is this enlightened being. So I said a very sort of strong sort of story here, but I said a very important one in sort of Chinese history, because I said it basically empowers women in various sort of ways within Chinese history. So basically, I said it legitimates the motif of marriage abuse. Of course, in traditional Chinese society, you have to get married to carry on the lineage. It's like through the legend of Miao Shan, there's like this religious legitimation for a woman to say, no, I don't want to get married. I want to go and become a nun instead. So instead of like being seen as something that's sort of unfilial, sort of against your sort of family piety, it justifies it on religious grounds. Again, female celibacy is also justified through this. Also interesting, we'll come back to this, self-mutilation. But of course she cuts off her own hands and eyes, and of course again in Chinese sort of culture you're not allowed to mutilate your own body, this is a gift from your parents. But I said all of these are legitimated through this. I said some sorts of also does accommodate sort of women to their roles, and sort of why it is like I told about sort of their position through kind of various bits of narrative around the text. But I said it does sort of make something else possible. So basically I said out of the Lotus Sutra, I said this very patriarchal text where it's clear, even if women become sort of quite advanced spiritually, they still always have to become men. We started getting us a story coming out of it, which does legitimate a path for females, basically, if not getting to enlightenment themselves, at least very nearly getting close to it, and legitimating sort of women's religious life. So that's one aspect of the Lotus Sutra. Another one I put down here as burning for the Buddha, is about the way the Lotus Sutra tells us that setting fire to yourself is okay. So it's a legitimation for self-immolation, and I'll take a contemporary example as well. So in one of the chapters of this, there's a story about the medicine king Bodhisattva, and in it, he is seen as sort of self-immolating. Basically, as the story goes, his devotion to the Buddha is sort of so great, he said he will even set fire to himself to sort of show his devotion. Now, as far as we can tell in the text, this is just complete hyperbole. This is not meant to be taken literally in any way. It's basically just saying, oh, the Buddha is so fantastic, I'll do anything sort of for him. And it's basically this sort of metaphorical sort of story. And I said there's nothing or any notice of this ever happening in the Indian tradition that this comes out of. However, in China, they start to take it slightly more literally. I said it's also quite essential to find in Miao Shan's story. I said to find that as her auto-immolation at the end of the story. But the first historical narrative we have around this, I said written late 4th or early 5th century, is about a monk called Dao Du, who dies in 527, and basically, so we're told, upon death, he automatically sort of, self-cremates, basically. Now this fits into sort of kind of patterns of Buddhist death, where sort of monks are cremated, and also like their remains are seen as sort of having sort of special sort of relics within them potentially. So I said this is seen as an auspicious sign. And I said it comes in a part of subsequent Sinitic or Chinese Buddhism. I said it's never sort of a common occurrence, so it doesn't happen sort of very often, but it does happen from time to time. And I said often it's just a partial burning of one part of your body to show your devotion. And there's one story of a monk who goes to advise an emperor on a certain sort of course of action, and the emperor refuses to take his advice. So he goes to the marketplace the next day, and he's preaching, and as he's preaching, he sticks his arm into a bucket of tar and sets fire to his arm. And he carries on preaching while his arm burns, and basically all the flesh burns off, and it's just left with the bones and the charred flesh. So this is a historical record, as far as we can make out, that it's actually happening. And because of this, the emperor sort of says, you're so devoted, I will follow your advice. So it kind of like has a political effect in terms of this. It also, I think, becomes quite normative. And of course, you can always tell Chinese monks and nuns, so the dots on their heads, part of your initiation, you have incense sticks which burn on your head, so you'll see the dots on there. So basically, Chinese monks will stand out from other Buddhist monks and nuns in this regard. I said it also, perhaps as in Chinese sort of context, needs a bit of explanation. I said it's put into the Buddhist sort of context, what is known as abandoning the body. So drowning, starvation, and being fed to animals is part of this. And of course, if you know the Buddha's stories before, there were various stories of his life before he became sort of the historical Buddha, and in one of them, basically he sees this this tigress, this female tiger, who's too weak to sort of feed her cubs. So basically he cuts his own wrists and he feeds himself to this tiger. And I think it's in this ultimate sort of form of compassion that he gives himself his own life to this other creature so it can live and look after its children. So there is this Buddhist narrative for this, which I said goes against, I said, the typical sort of Chinese, I guess, sort of care for the body. And the classical theory or piety domain text on this, I said, it basically tells you can never harm your body because it's this gift from your parents. So I said it legitimates this. Now, what I said is perhaps interesting is the way this is taken to contemporary examples. And you may all be familiar with this picture. It's Quick Quang Dock. And this was taken in Saigon. It's in the middle of the Vietnamese War. And as you may know, as part of the protests against it, there was a series of sort of monks who set fire to themselves, and he was the first one to do this. So in the middle of sort of Saigon, he has his crowd sort of stand around him so they know you can get close to him. He covers himself in petrol and then sits there in sort of meditative pose as he sort of burns to death. Now, the response of this, I said the context of the Vietnam War is part of what needs to take that hand to sort of universal fame. So I said this sort of event leads him to write his book, Lotus in a Sea of Fire, to explain what's going on in Vietnam, and to explain why, if you like, a Buddhist sort of would do this. There's nothing else they can do. So this, if you like, is the ultimate act of a bodhisattva, to show his compassion for other people. It's also worth mentioning another very famous Buddhist scholar, a man called Walpola Rahula, absolutely rejects it. He's a Sri Lankan sort of Buddhist scholar, and he basically says that this is not allowed within Buddhism. It's a form of violence, because basically destroying the Buddhism is a form of violence, and also suicide, which is not allowed. And of course, as a Sri Lankan, he is I think, a Theravadan tradition, so they don't accept the Lotus Sutra. But for Thich Nhat Hanh, if like there's this tradition which legitimates this. So I said this sort of act here is legitimated through this text. Now, one more case story. I said it's simply about the Lotus Sutra as the supreme authority. So firstly, a little Japanese story. There are two priests who live in temples next door to each other, Hogan and Renzo. And Hogan is a devotee of the Avatamsaka Sutra, Renzo is a devotee of the Lotus Sutra. And basically they recite their sutras every day, and because of Hogan's sort of devotion to his sutra, basically the gods who come to him out of his devotion bring him food every day. So one day he decides he'll invite his friend Renzo over to basically sort of show that, you know, because his devotion to his particular sutra is so great that he gets his food from these sort of gods every day. And he asked the gods to deliver, like, you know, dinner for two that particular evening. So he invites Renzo over, and they sit there sort of talking, but no food turns up. So as the evening wears on, Renzo leaves and basically goes. And after he's gone, this food for two is delivered. Now, it may seem in the story that perhaps Renzo wasn't so good or his sutra wasn't so good, which is why he didn't get the food. However, the narrative goes on to explain that because the gods who came to Renzo, the spirits were so powerful, basically Hogan's spirits couldn't get into the temple. They're basically kept outside by these incredibly powerful protected spirits all around Renzo. It was only after he'd gone that basically his spirits could get in and deliver the food. So obviously the story that the recitation of the Lotus Sutra is more spiritually potent than the other sutra. I said this is taken perhaps furthest by Nichiren, who found sort of his own school of Buddhism, and of course contemporary Soka Gakkai comes out of this. So, quote here, if there are likewise those who read some other sutra and do so thinking that the Lotus Sutra is inferior to those sutras, then they are doing violence to the very heart of those other sutras. So basically, no other suture is better than the lotus suture. You've got to realise the lotus suture is best. But even more than this, even though one reads the lotus suture, if he thinks that he may also gain enlightenment through any other suture as well, he is not really reading the lotus suture. So this is kind of radical. There is only one suture which will get you enlightenment, only one suture will get you to nirvana. Basically, the other ones may be sort of good preparation, but this is the only sort of true Buddhist text in effect. So, as the practice of this sort of tradition sort of develops, because the Lotus Sutra is the essence of the Dharma, all you have to do is to recite the title. The title is the quintessence of it. And what you see here is what is called Gonhosen. It's what the Soka Gakkai Buddhists sort of use when they're reciting the title, and it's basically literally in summation of the Lotus Sutra. This is kind of his summary of the essence of that sutra. So if you're a Soka Gakkai Buddhist, you'll sit there and recite the title of the Lotus Sutra, Om Nam Ho Renge Kyo, basically sort of hail to the magnificence of lotus, and you'll look at this thing, and that is basically your religious practice. So I said, sutra is so powerful, you don't need any other form of meditation. All you need is just the title of this sutra. So I said we have here 3 reading strategies around it. I said the first one, you read it for particular sort of stories within this sutra. And I said, although they support traditional gender roles, I said they can lead to more subversive sort of roles with things in it. So I said potential from this story, let alone other stories, is basically to act differently, to empower sort of women's religious life. I said that self-immolation, I said depends on if the Lotus Sutra as like inspirational or literal. I said in its earliest usage, it seems these ideas are like of burden for the Buddha is simply kind of like sort of hyperbole, it's rhetoric. But later on, it gets taken sort of literally. So I said it becomes necessary to act out its injunctions, but I said it also legitimizes what seems as antisocial or violent acts. Things which would not normally be tolerated become possible. This is the text. And I said the other thing, I said is, seeing it as a supreme Buddhist text, so you only need to recite sort of the essence of it. So I said, here is the authority of the Lotus Sutra itself, and I said as Nichiren, as a bodhisattva, and therefore its interpreter. So, a few thoughts. I said, how does the Lotus Sutra legitimate and create a habitus? And also, do we construct its meanings, or does it construct our meanings? So, are we reading the text and seeing what's in there, or are we sort of, creating meanings for the text out of what we need? And of course, within this, is any reading true? Are any of these readings better than other readings? So I'll give you, I said, 3 sort of samples from the Lotus sort of Sutra. So again, if you want to get back into your groups and discuss what you think is going on in this text, is it giving us certain teachings that we take away? Are we making teachings, putting them into the text? And how does it sort of create a world which we inhabit where things become possible, which weren't possible before?
What is Mahayana? Like the southern strand, Sri Lanka. Yeah.
And it pops out from
Yeah, it's very clean and really pure.
and it becomes really beautiful and it grows in the mud. Yeah. So it actually represents therefore the life of the
Yeah.
So it's totally different from this
sense of the world through that we have scriptures and then we try to make sense of the scriptures, so it's like
areas of getting to the meaning of life.
Yeah.
But I think the bigger question is there true? We don't think so.
But Buddhism is not
Their own subjective. If let's say we take the if there is a position, Osama bin Laden has his way of interpreting the Quran. That's his way. So, I mean, is that problematic?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are some readings which are obviously wrong.
So there is.
Yeah, but you know, like which is the true meaning, even within the so-called more correct readings.
so the reason gives it habitus,
Which
that's how you live.
There are always different interpretations, and even for the religious texts themselves, there's often
So do we
some
construct the meaning or the lotus
controversy or
construct
translation
the
of
meaning?
you know,
So
whether they are really
that part it should be the human
whether
agency,
everything
right?
like
So faculty of reason, giving, meaning,
Because when it comes to true
that
interpretation,
shape
normally it's
your
nothing to do with the text. It's about authority. Like, true
Wow.
people say, I have the right to interpret this because I know best. And this is the true meaning.
text is full of symbolism, the allegoric symbol, allegories and symbolism. So as taken as it is, it doesn't really create
Yeah.
So, but is that the consequence everybody wants, or
Buddha might have
even
meant,
if we talk about religious
doesn't mean Buddha actually meant it.
authorities also
Because like we actually take the scriptures and everything and we try to do something like
Well, I'm sure it's not the only one who says so.
so
So how
in
that
that sense
ties into
like
the consequence? So if it's greater good, then what's his interpretation will be wrong.
that's the reason like in Buddhism Buddha
So
told
is that you can
don't
consider
take everything
one
as
way
it
to
is,
see
even the scripture itself.
sort of a type of
You
But if you
have
want
to
to
reason it on
deconstruct it
yourself,
further, what are the
argue it,
consequences? Can be seen in a very
make
subjective
your
light.
own
Like,
judgment.
I mean, the consequence to
Do
him
not
is
follow
good
the scripture as it
because to us it's bad.
is. You don't make sense.
Because he has a certain worldview which is necessary to interpret it that way. So in order to establish Islam as a dominion over all other religions, you have to engage in a war and violence.
Yeah.
That's how he sees it. So to him that consequence is a collateral
But
damage.
it's like this, ultimately when we reason the sutta itself, it actually gives meaning to our life because we try to review the sutta with us.
But when
So
you go into
when
scriptures and texts, then
we try
just
to review
zero
the
in on the
sutta,
on very specific.
actually
So and that's when they try to interpret,
it's actually constructs a meaning
without
of our happiness.
going back to the basic tenets. So all these
Because
specific
of
you
the-
need to link it back to the basic tenets.
The human agency comes from
But how do you I believe it.
It's like agency. It's saying this.
I mean, I didn't know about it until, some read letter and all that.
You can
But how do you
construct
It depends on who utilize it. But, I mean, some people will put emphasis on it. Some say this is not important. It depends on the context of the person. If you feel that you are at war with the United States, it becomes a very important concept. Because you can use it to mobilize people against an enemy. Yeah, if you are in different situations, like in Singapore, it's okay. It's not an important concept. Why do you need to talk about Islam? Meaning in the answer.
But you think it's not energy,
That's a learning behavior.
Depends, I mean, if you're a Sufi, okay, if you're a Sufi, which many people in Arab jihad. So you will interpret jihad as an internal struggle to make yourself better. There's a Sufi interpretation of jihad. Based on one hadith, the Prophet came back from the war. He said, now we are facing a greater jihad. The companion said, we just came back from war, but we couldn't be better. So it's jihad against your own desires. That's how the Sufi
Takes
see
all
it.
time after the passing on of the founder or the messenger. The Quran was
The leader of the Sufi
written and documented during the time of
spiritual aspect.
the Chinese after death of Prophet.
That's why the American Iran Corporation suggests that on the side of that, if you want to combat global terrorism, it's to empower the Sufi Muslims.
Disciples
Because
gather and all these teachings, including the sutras.
more internal,
So text came after the
less political.
So, and I think you can only, text only has meaning
Because
when there
Muslims
are
also
traditions
change
together. The traditions come
It's a
from
complex
the
situation.
founder himself or the person here. But the person is supposed to embody the meaning of the text. Goes to that.
Deconstructing meaning. We have our own context that makes us construct the text according to our meaning. But sometimes the text constructs us.
There's still limitation.
But that's also our understanding of what text actually means.
Does not explain everything about the text.
Yeah, we can't run away from
And
it.
then beyond that there will be very, there will be sage,
That's impossible, right?
or very key leaders, or scholars, or devout saints, like the saints.
But that is my context, right? If you talk to another person,
Saints and sages, so that's after the drop of the messenger is meant to further clarify the text. So some people don't see it in Islam also, there are many philosophers, thinkers,
but even that is contextual. Depends who you talk to.
so this is true for every religion.
But there's one element that
Communication of text.
someone who really believes in
Is any religion
connection
true?
with the divine. You say, no, this is not my
Religion
interpretation,
is all about
because this is
text.
guided by the Holy Spirit or God actually shows me this meaning. How do you counter that? I mean, I'm sure someone will not say my context gives me this meaning. You say, this is how God guided me to see this meaning. That's why you can't rehabilitate it.
It's very problematic.
Some people can, those who really believe so.
I mean, our reading of the world around us, or what our norms and normatives are, they also change over time, right? Like, it's not just pertaining to religion. Like, for example, even in religion, what parts of Quran you think, for example, if today jihad, so-called jihad, before that, depending on the state of Islam,
Okay, I think that
it was a different religion. What dominated was very different today. Hinduism is the same thing.
okay, they've finished on this side. Are you happy to
What's the first which
come and join in?
the first and we sing that. Oh,
Maybe you'll let Sermon finish off
no,
first.
it's something like that.
Yeah. Okay, as you guys have finished first, I think it's best if you
Okay.
give us your answers.
I think our conclusion was that it works both ways, and very often, like what Swapning was saying, it's many different layers because of the interplay between what we think the text means and our interpretation, and how we use it to how we use the text to support various ideas.
Okay, so there's always an interaction between the text and us that we're in a kind of a dialogue with it. Okay. Anything you'd like to throw in to supplement that?
We had a similar point as well about how human agency affects habitism, habitism in turn affects human agency. It's just a reinforcing cycle.
This one's a slight problem, I think. I mean, we agree that you can't escape from your context. So if you have your context, the tendency for you to read into the scripture that will confirm whatever preconceptions you have. But if you don't know anything about that subject, then probably who you talk to, who you listen to will also shape how the text actually means to you. So the text also shapes you. But that also goes through the agency of another human being. But the problem here is, how do you counter, or how do you engage with someone who says there is no human element, because there is that notion of, for the Christian, that say the Holy Spirit guides me into reading this particular way, or this is God guiding me to understand the text in this way. So, I mean,
well, that, if you follow this, you'll be reading, well, you'll see what reading they get out of it. If they say, I've been inspired to do a certain thing. I remember when I was at university, we had a new college chaplain turn up, who, against the traditions of my teaching university, who've been very kind of sort of what we call high church, Anglo-Catholic sort of rituals and stuff, he was an evangelical who'd come in. And he didn't obviously like the way things were happening to college chapel. So he came in one day and told the university that he had had a vision, a dream, in which God had told him to come in and sweep away everything that was old and do about sort of these broad changes. So this, of course, legitimated what he was doing. We put that because it was very convenient that his dream or vision suited exactly what he wanted to do already, which he wasn't very happy about. I think kind of being evangelical, so because you tell people these things and it's accepted as, you know, you've had this revelation, and people being a bit more scholarly and academic and telling him, you know, that's very suspicious. Sort of dismantle it. So yes, I mean, you'll take that, and if you like, when I came from, you would read it in terms of, well, you know, whose advantage is it that this revelation has come down? What are the effects of this revelation? So yes, you'll treat it as any other source, if you like, to look at. Okay, one thing that is perhaps of turn up, if habitus is always created so they just kind of always reading within us, how do things change? Because of course sometimes people read a new text or create a new tradition and they just completely change what they've done before. They throw out the old, they bring in something sort of very radical. So where's the place for that? If we're always only reading our meanings into something, where does the new come from?
The way we make meaning ourselves depends on the context that we are. So if the social, cultural, political atmosphere around us, environment's going to change, the way we make meanings of a particular thing will completely change.
Okay.
I think we also have to be mindful that not all texts should be read with context in mind, because some of the texts are plain, you know, and you have to just take it as what it is, you know. Yeah, just like, you know, the other night I was reading the Quran and I was looking at the, you know, the meaning of it. It's so simple, you know. Say that, oh, you who believe do not enter the house of the prophet unless you are permitted for it. You know? How do you understand it differently, you know? For me, not so early, that means you don't go there so early, because otherwise you have to wait for its preparation. But when you're invited, go inside. Then once you have the meal, just disperse, you know. Just disperse. And do not sit for long, being keen for a chat. This conduct of yours hurts the prophet, but he feels shy of telling you about it. You know, so it's a Quranic verse, you know. It's very plain, right? And when you visit somebody, don't stay for too long, like, you know. The host so shy to tell you to go back in. So when I read it, I said, it's so simple, you know. I don't need to understand is there any other meaning behind this, you know? I mean, it's so plain, you know? It's so direct, and you just take it. That's what it is.
It tells us that Muhammad was being really annoyed by these people coming around to his house. So he had to write Revelation at that time.
No, he's
God
trying
said
to
this.
say.
Yes.
I mean, like the 10 commandments, for example, are very plainly written, very easy to understand. But maybe it's when people try to apply it to different situations, different contexts, that they sometimes face uncertainty, and then that's when they go back to, you know, say religious leaders to seek guidance, and then different interpretations. So,
It's also due to translation as well, because of course, number 3, I think it is, in English it says do not kill. It actually says do not murder. And of course, what does murder mean? Can you kill in self-defense? Can the state kill people? So what is legitimate and what's not legitimate killing comes into that. And also, I shouldn't covet my neighbour's ox, but my neighbour doesn't have an ox. He might have an Audi, so I can like his Audi, but I can't like his ox. So, yes, you get, all sorts of issues coming out. Right. Okay, we spent slightly longer. I will try and scoot through the last case study quite quickly, so we're not here too long. But it leads into this last one, about any reading being true. Because I said a normal rule of social constructionism that basically all readings are legitimate, they're just true within a context. But there may be times that we want to prefer some readings to other readings. And this brings us to Christian anti-Semitism. So, we come to the New Testament, and of course lots of people tell us what we need to do is go back to the text because they're all nice, but this isn't always the case. So a few little bits about Jews in the New Testament. So in the first one, the Jews accept the killing of Jesus. It's on them and their descendants, so they're to blame continually throughout time. Jews are from the devil. Basically, Jews have rejected God, they've rejected his message, so it's now going to other people. And it tells us here that they suffered like the Jews did, who killed Jesus and the prophets, so that's kind of what the Jews do. And again, the Jews are the synagogue of Satan. So, obviously, reading the New Testament is not a good thing to do if you're Jewish. And this basically continues through the Christian tradition, which one scholar, Miller, has put down as the ABCs of anti-Semitism. I've read another slightly large quote, but sort of basically gets to the point, I think.
The Quran is better, huh?
Yes.
No, in terms of condemning the Jews, they're very harsh here, no?
But the hadith is very harsh.
Yeah, but I guess because the Christians and Jews were in direct conflict at that time, so the writings come out a lot more.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, basically, they were one tradition which was separating out, so it's basically like a family feud, and therefore they're. Yes. Yeah, so you get to ABC, Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. Yes, and it is a very nasty film if you look at it, the satanic messages coming out of that. Now, this sort of continues onwards, and Luther is perhaps a good sort of example of this. Now, initially, he's reasonably sympathetic towards the Jews. 1523, he writes a book that Christ was born a Jew, in which he says we should take a sympathetic stance to them. Jesus was a Jew himself, so we need to have to go out and convert them. However, they don't convert, so he writes another book, Jews and Their Lives, in which he likens an unwanted pestilence and says they're demonic. So no one wants them, the countryside and roads are open to them, we should gladly give them presents to get rid of them, they're a heavy burden on us, a scourge, a pestilence, This is proved by the fact they've recently been expelled by force from France, from Spain, in my own lifetime, from lattice body.
So probably Hitler read this,
Yes. Well, you haven't seen the worst bit yet. And again, they're demonic. So aside from the devil, you have no more venomous enemy, desperate enemies of the Lord. So, what's the remedy? And this is the really nasty bit. So Hitler's final solution is basically putting into practice Luther's ideas, which obviously were not put into practice in his time. And indeed, this is why churches in Germany, to a large support, supported what Hitler was doing. If you know Kristallnacht, the night sort of when all the Jewish properties and businesses were first attacked, one of the Lutheran archbishops celebrated the fact that it was the anniversary of Luther's death, and Luther would surely be pleased with what was going on. So, I mean, there's kind of a very clear direct link, if you like, from the Christian texts through to tradition into the Holocaust. So, this, as it obviously brings us to the question of how to deal with it. So, as a bit of a baseline, I said you can't say that anti-Semitism is a misreading of text or margin. It's very clearly there. So I said it's completely scriptural. I said it's endorsed by the major church fathers, popes and reformers, basically all levels of the church do this. And I said this direct line is not inevitable by a Luther from the New Testament to Hitler and death camps. And still actually today, if you go to church next Friday, Good Friday, you'll probably be in various churches where they will recite this, and the bits will be read out of the Bible where the Jews are the people killing Jesus, despite the fact obviously historically that didn't happen, but it's still part of the liturgies. So, when we come to authority in these structures, how to deal with these texts? If you consider the scripture has authority, if particular teachers have got authority, what do you do when you realise you've actually got some very, very nasty texts on your hands? Do these bits of scripture not have authority anymore? And of course, if that's the case, it then has an impact on the whole of the text. Again, particular sort of leaders, and particularly for Lutherans, what do you make of Luther after this? How do you sort of come back as a Lutheran in particular, and and rethink your whole tradition which comes out of him? And again, I said, do we actually need the masters of suspicion here? I mean, even without them, we can tell that there's a big, big problem within this. So, any thoughts? If we want to say that is perhaps the true reason, I'm assuming most of us would do and say that not being anti-Semitic is better than being anti-Semitic, how do you support one particular reading as in some sense true or proper or good against another one? I said social constructionism on the whole doesn't allow you to do this. There's just different readings. What ISIS says and what anybody else, a Muslim says, they're all equally true. There's just all constructions. This is just one way of looking at it, this is another. Anti-Semitism is one way of being Christian, not being anti-Semitic is another. So, how would you deal with this? Any thoughts?
I heard Paul Luther, trying to address this, and he thought that it's not the will of God what needs to happen. That was his first statement. Second statement is that he said I can't remember now, he said we have to go back to the first century of the Common Era BC, where there were certain verses in the New Testament which have been, again, misread or misconstrued, or misunderstood to establish this hatred and against the Jews, So I think he's asking to go back to text,
Yes, but I mean, some people do this, but I said certainly, I mean, the texts, it's, there are very clear differences to there. Yes, I said John is taken to be the worst of the Gospels. And I mean, that's very clear that the use of the blame for Jesus is death, that they are sort of demonic as it's presented there. I mean, I said, as I said, I mean, John is understood to be a fairly late gospel, so you could kind of argue that, John represents a later Christian tradition. And I think that's one way to deal with this. So, the text is a human construction, it's slightly later. But of course, I mean, there's a strong kind of liberal way of reading the text for that. The Christian text just simply sort of human constructions. It's the early church putting their thoughts together. So this isn't sort of Jesus' words, it's not sort of divine revelation. However, of course, I think that's very problematic for churches as a whole. Most sort of Christians in the pews, who aren't theologically educated, will understand these to be authoritative texts, which I said, they're still read out in the churches. I said, the churches know that these are horrible texts which distort the history. And the Jews are not responsible for Jesus. He's crucified, we know he's the Romans, and they don't have the authority to do this. But I said, it doesn't talk about this next week, this will be read out.
Then, in that case, then why say it happened that the Jews are the ones who crucified Jesus Christ, and the whole community has seen for that. But that is context.
It is context,
yes.
yes.
For that particular moment in history, that time, and then group of people, and that's it. So you cannot go on hating Jews forever and ever, right?
Yes.
So maybe that's another way of
That's one way, but then again, of course, I said you have to take that passage from Matthew, the blood is on us, and our descendants.
The problem is what you understand by authority of the text. We will face a lot of problems if, for example, our understanding of that authority is a ad verbatim word of God. Plus the idea that that text is relevant for all time and context. This is a fundamentalist reading of the text. So you will have a problem, you will have this dilemma.
Yes.
But I think one way out is to see the historicity of the text. And therefore text, although we can say generally is divine inspired, but it is also located in human experience in a certain period of history. And therefore some of the texts need not be taken to be applicable in all times, although we can still derive meaning and we can still derive good from that text, but it may not be applicable. It's like hudud, I mean the text is clear, you still chop off the hands. How do you interpret that in another way? Of course there are some way of interpreting it, but that is not faithful enough to what actually happened in history. It does mean literally chopping off hands. You can't read it any other way, But now, of course, people say, oh, let's suspend this because it's not the right context. You still can't run away from this very literal understanding of the text.
Okay, but of course that means that sort of when these passages are read out in church, the priest's job will basically to give a historical context around them, which, is that necessarily the role of the priest?
I mean, it depends where you're coming from. Yes. If you're a fundamentalist reading, you won't look at the historicity of it. I mean, the Quran talks about slavery also, but today nobody will call on slavery. ISIS maybe. Right?
I think the approach being taken by the church is in the form of demonizing the other so as to legitimate their own political or legitimate authority, and basically demonizing the other versus maybe in other religions if you have, like, you don't demonize the other, but you just show how your own religion is good in itself. So there's a difference in that, in the sense that by demonizing the other, you are elevating your own church stand, and the feel that, or the risk is that if you don't do that, your own legitimate authority will collapse.
Yeah, I guess that sort of explains the whole context behind sort of, I said, these sort of texts coming out.
But a faithful Christian won't accept that explanation. I mean, these are writers who write inspired by God. So how can you imply that there's other motives?
That's what I think Paul was saying as well, that a lot, like majority of the Christians might not, like they would look at it as legitimate text and authority, because it's being spoken by the religious leader, by the church, and it's in a big, it's out in the open, it's not anything to do.
Yeah. Again, it comes back, I said, ideas of like sort of revelation and inspirations. I mean, there are different ideas in this. I mean, there are some that, you know, that scripture is basically dictated down from God. Other ones that, you know, God somehow generally inspired these writers, but if like basically the work is still their own, in which case, you know, they can interpret their own bits of understanding in there. And that's how the word, you know, texts aren't perfect. And technically that is the correct Christian understanding, because revelation technically is Jesus. Jesus is God's son, he's revelation. The text is like it's just a human record of that. And so kind of like the more fundamentalist reading that, you know, that the text is inerrant, is actually sort of, it's almost heretical in the Christian thought, or so it is taken as, you know, as being normal Christianity by most people today.
The problem of context for a lot of religious leaders to start contextualizing the historicity of a particular text, I mean, that just opens up Pandora's box, right? That if you say that do not read this the way you are reading it, don't read it literally, this is the context, then that just leaves the entire text open for such, you know, arguments and claims. And I doubt anybody really wants anybody to, you know, do that, because you then set a precedent that, okay, you know, probably John is problematic and what he says is problematic, and then you say, okay.
Yeah, I don't have to worry about his text anymore.
So you're questioning the idea of any faith is that, you know, what is written is sacrosanct, and that it's whether it's the word of God or it's divine. And when you start questioning parts from it, literally, then where do you start?
So you may end up discrediting the entire scripture.
Yeah, that is a big worry. So I mean, all the certain aspects of the Christian church, I mean, they'll all be sort of trained theologically. They'll know the problems in these texts, and they'll know that, you know, the Jews are historically not to blame. But when it comes down to preaching in the church, none of that actually gets passed down. Which I think is part of the reason you've mentioned again, because you also indicated, you know, if you, yeah.
I think Christian theology, at least, it's still a bit easier, because of course the fundamentalists would say that the Bible is the word of God, but in actual Christian theology, it's Jesus who is the word of God. This is the Logos made flesh. So the gospel records and everything else is a record of that. But Muslims have a huge problem, because it is generally regarded as the word of God. It's text.
Yes. So really, so I mean, Muslims have a bigger problem with the nasty bits of their text.
In a way,
Yes, I mean, having to say this, I mean, a lot of the churches have apologised. I mean, the Catholic Church has issued an official apology for its role in the Holocaust and anti-Semitism over the years, and most dozen major churches haven't well. So they've, you know, done something in the right direction. And the Roman Catholic Church came on Good Friday, there used to be a prayer in there for the perfidious Jews, which I said was now taken out. They also removed the prayer for the conversion of all Jews, but that was put in back by the last Pope. So they once again prayed for the conversion of all Jews. That's it, yes. Anyway, that I think gives us one of the problems around this. So just in conclusion, basically, another big quote, I won't get you read through that, I'll send you all the PowerPoints, you can read it if you want to. But I said some final sort of summaries of the last sort of 3 days. So basically, hopefully workshop 1, I said, got the idea there's no universal natural type or essence of religion, that basically create our perceptions of what a religion is, what it does, and these are also, I said, created and recreated over time. I said, yesterday we sort of talked about inside and outside, because they both kind of sort of carry implications of sort of, you know, of part there's a sort of power and authority, that, you know, what right does somebody have to speak in particular sort of context, and ultimately, like, you know, will emphasise certain things. So I said I did power negotiations between them. Today, from this perspective, I said, you know, text and photos are often portrayed in pure sort of spiritual narratives. But again, I said they all have a part to play in this. And I said even if you like a scriptural text, which religious believers will treat as kind of sacrosanct, I said also have their own agendas and basically created as part of this. And I said it's about positioning sort of self and also, which I think sort of you mentioned on this last sort of bit about these texts about the Jews. Yes, I mean, it's basically saying we're better, and to make us sound better, we have to put somebody else sort of down. And I said this sort of happens all the way through them. So probably I said various sort of aspects of this which is significant for interreligious studies. And I said I will leave that as sort of like an open sort of question to take away sort of from this, so how you sort of use this like in relation to comparing sort of different sort of religious traditions. I'm not sure if you're aware, but just a few days ago on Monday there was a big debate in the European Parliament on interreligious dialogue. They brought various religious leaders in, particularly sort of Jewish, sort of Christian and Muslims, and they debated in the interreligious sphere. And one scholar of religion sort of recorded this debate online with the word on top of it, data. As in, this is something to explore. What legitimates the idea that interreligious dialogue is a good idea? Whose interests are served by interreligious dialogue? What is like the results of it? So I said this sort of critical reading doesn't necessarily say you need to get on, but whose power interests are served by different readings of this. So I said a list of references. I will send on all of the PowerPoints to everyone, so you'll have those. Any last questions, thoughts, ideas? Or is 3 days been enough for you?
Definitely not enough, but I thought, well, thank you very much. I think you had given us a good introduction. Of course, there are many questions and of course further discussion will be needed, and then you'll be around with us for quite a while. So I think if I can just end the class today, on behalf of the whole class, all 8 of us, plus Muhammad and Ruslan, I would like to thank you for your time and your